Should they do something about these trade demands? With the whole Jimmy Butler thing, Lillard last season, is this something where the league should intervene? Or is your position that, look, if you try, the externalities are worse than allowing what's happening to happen?
Well, the number one problem is that they just dominate the conversation. Why do they dominate the conversation? Because the games themselves don't mean that much. And so you need something to talk about on all of these. And so that's a big part of it. And then I don't think there's really anything that they can do, honestly. Like, you can't make Jimmy Butler try harder in a game. Like, he's supposed to have a financial incentive to do that. Like, even in the NFL, I actually think that guys should tank more in the NFL and like not try to get what they want. But that's just like not part of the culture in the NFL, which is probably helps. And there's this idea that you're killing your teammates too much if you're gonna, like, the QB who wants to get traded or wants a new contract just like sails every third pass out of bounds or something. Like they would never do that. But I don't know what you can do there. And there has to be a legal framework to this stuff. Like, you can't just take someone's money away unless they're doing something that's very objective, that's collectively bargained ahead of time. And the Heat, I mean, I'd be interested to see what happens with Miami. Like, they have actually suspended Butler. I don't think they're really going to be that successful in taking his money away under the CBA. So I don't really think there's much they could do. But there haven't been that many trade demands of late either. Like, that's like, you've only had a few of these sagas from like James Harden and Jimmy Butler, who ultimately like don't really matter that much, if we're being honest at this point. Like if they actually were that good and mattered, they would be on a team that they wouldn't want to get traded from.
I agree with that. I do think that it's tricky because I think part of what's afflicted the NBA is this raising of consciousness of the people who really matter within it. And that put a lot of other people off, that superstars actually exerted their full leverage, that LeBron showed just how valuable a superstar is and how many shots you could really call. And you can't unknow that. You can't unring that bell. I'm watching a funny discussion take place in the NFL because every season there are quarterback contracts. And I just got interested in this. I'm interested in my NBA perspective on the NFL because a lot of the discussions in NFL media seem silly to me. And maybe I'm wrong and they're right. Who knows? But I look at it and I look at quarterback
Why
deals.
do you say that? You don't believe that. You believe you're right.
No,
just say you're
of course
right.
I don't. Of course I don't.
The soup is bad. Just send it back. Send it back.
I'm just trying to be nice. I'm trying not to get too arrogant about it.
Yeah, but just give your opinion. Nobody's gonna like be nicer to you if you're like pretending to be slightly more humble about it. Just give your take. That's what we're here for. People are paying you to say what you think.
Well, now I'm in this MC Escher sketch right now where I'm going, well, wait a second. Nate's telling me to be more disagreeable, but maybe I need to be disagreeing with Nate when he's telling me this to truly achieve it. On quarterback payment, I saw Chris Sims talking about this. This is in the context of the Purdy contract. We don't get into Purdy specifically, but he was saying it's killing the sport that the quarterbacks are getting paid so much money right now when they're not even that good. It's killing our sport, he said. And I looked at it and I went, quarterbacks could negotiate a lot more money than they're getting paid. If somebody is dispassionately taking a step back and looking at the sport, as far as I can see in observing how the NFL works, well, it's all about your draft picks and whether your quarterback is good. And if the quarterback's getting 20% of the cap, which is what the elite guys get right now, they should kind of be getting a lot more. But it's just not the culture of the sport to really hold the team to that and drag them through it. And you'd be bucking against a lot of conventional wisdom and everything else to say, nope, that's my value. You better pay me that. That's my value. Figure out the rest of the roster. And I think that's a situation right there where if a bunch of quarterbacks adopted that mentality, I do think it would hurt the sport. And yet that probably is their value. And so that's so much of what's afflicted the NBA right now. It's just people getting smarter about the sport has broken some of the conventions, and the bonds of the sport are being frayed by it. And that's a very difficult problem to solve.
Would it reduce NBA superstars' value if there were no max contract? If LeBron James were actually getting paid the probably 70, even 80% at his peak of the salary cap that analytics models say that he deserves, would that actually give those guys less power to determine their fate? I think it might.
Yeah. Oh God, I can't even. Well, we're now in such a weird situation with the NBA too, where they've got a salary cap, but kind of like a weird salary cap, and it's again the complexity. I think is a problem as well. You might disagree as somebody who's better versed in it than I am, but I think it might benefit the sport if it was clear as to how it works.
But football is just as complex. It's just in different ways. All the like bonus stuff and
true.
It's just that free agency isn't as big of a part of football and how much cap space you have. It's just not as big of a deal in football, but it's just as complex. I don't think that really changed. I think to the extent, I think there are a lot of people who get way more into the NBA because they're interested in that kind of business stuff. Well, and also it's fascinating. You should subscribe to Duncan so you can learn more about it.
Yes.
But so here's my thing on this, right? So the NBA limits, the most you can get is 35% of the salary cap. For guys in their prime, it's usually more like 25 or 30% of the salary cap. And you can go over the salary cap in certain instances. So it probably ends up being, in terms of what your typical payroll is, it ends up being more like 35% of the salary cap is maybe 30% of your team's salary or so. And because there's only 5 players on the floor, if you really have the guys at the absolute top of the league, your top 5 players should be making 50% of the salary cap, 60, even like an all-time great 70%. Like Nikola Jokic should probably be making 70% of the salary cap. And then that would, of course, limit everything else that you could do.
How much would that be right now in today's structure?
So the salary cap this year, I think, is 142 million. So that's $100 million basically.
I mean, but the new TV money too, that's going to bump up a bit. And
so here's why it would give them less power though, because then once they get paid that though, how are they going to get to these other teams? There's only so many teams that could possibly afford them. It would be impossible for superstars to team up, although that hasn't even necessarily gone that well since the Warriors. None of those teams have really won a championship.
True.
I mean, I guess you could say LeBron and AD would be the one maybe.
If we count
but that wasn't a free agent signing. But and that's still only 2 stars. Like I don't think people looked at that roster and like, oh, it's totally unfair. This team is like so stacked, no one can compete with them. They weren't the favorite going into that year. But then
we don't know if they would have. Yeah. We don't know if they would have won in a real playoff. I mean, they've got a fair argument.
That's true too. I think probably not.
Yeah. Oh, you think probably not? I don't know. I'm not married to probably not, but I didn't know that you thought probably not on the Laker frictionless bubble run. I just look at it as I can't call that a championship. I know it technically is, but I also can't say they double negativing all over here that they wouldn't have won it if it were a real postseason. I just can't look at that as a real postseason. I can't.
Yeah. I mean, it's a different circumstance, but they won what was in front of them. If you want to say that it's a little different than other championships, but I think you could argue I think it was really more delegitimized by the fact that they had an unbelievably easy path and some injuries from the teams that they faced as well, and that they had a veteran team, and that setting was way more conducive to a veteran team making it through and not having to deal with some of the physical rigors of being at the end of a long season, having to travel in the playoffs. So it was a little bit different, but I think the bigger thing is that they didn't really play anyone in those playoffs.